continue in our suffering series this morning? You're here. You chose this. Let's keep going. The reality is, as we lead up to Easter, we wanted to pause and spend a number of weeks in a series called Hurt, where we're actually exploring the spirituality of suffering. This is not something that's new by any means. If you actually go further and further back in not only just history, but even church history, you will see more and more language around the ways of suffering. And you'll see suffering actually being one of the very key elements into you and I experiencing transformation. Now, I know that even as we say that, in our modern world and the ways in which we live right now, we actually try to do everything possible to avoid suffering. And when we are suffering, we try to find ways to have it end as fast as possible. Suffering is something that really, though, you and I experience no matter what. Some would even say that life is suffering, and suffering is actually to live. And while that isn't good news, I think along the way we can actually start to find good news by the ways of Jesus. So as we even start this morning, I just want you to maybe even pause and just allow yourself to come to the way in which you might be suffering right now. If you actually sat long enough and thought, some of you didn't have to think long at all. Some of you might have multiple things. But what ways are you experiencing suffering? There's an author on suffering, and he breaks it down into these few categories, and I found this helpful, so it might be helpful for you. We can see suffering as something that's been done to us, something that we've done ourselves. And then what we'll talk about a bit more today is how we share in Christ's suffering. What's been done to us? It might be something from 30 years ago. It might be something from this past week. It might be something that someone did intentionally to you. It might be something unintentionally. It would be more of something external that has actually happened to you. What we maybe have done to ourselves might have been intentional or unintentional. Might actually be an action that you've taken. Another thing that we talk about in some of our discipleship work is false narratives. It might be just a thought pattern that you have. I don't know if you've ever been in a friendship or a relationship and something happens and then you spend like a few days suffering, thinking about the thing that happened or the thing you're believing about what that person's thinking, and then come to find out they actually weren't thinking that at all, but you stepped into a false narrative for a number of days. All right, so suffering doesn't even have to be a physical thing. It might be a mental thing. It's the things in which we make meaning of along the way that might not actually be the meaning. And then there's ways in which we actually share in Christ's suffering. And as modern people, I wonder how far away we've actually moved from this idea that to follow Jesus is actually choosing a way of suffering. For the early church, there was actually no separation for them in this. When they chose to follow Jesus, what many of them were choosing were actually physical death. When they chose to follow Jesus, they were actually choosing to be ostracized from their community, their family, their friends, even the ways in which they had an ability to make an income. When they choose to follow the ways of Jesus, in so many ways, they consider their lives over in that moment. Yet they knew that there was something so much more that they could never attain on their own or in and through themselves. It was worth these sacrifices. That was worth this suffering. You have a card on your chair. We're not going to do anything with it now, but what we'll do in a little bit, or a few moments actually, will just be to reflect a little bit more, and I'm going to have you write some stuff. So that first question of breaking down maybe where you might be suffering will become relevant here in a moment. And so maybe we'll just keep that in front of us. There is an author, Larissa McFarquhar, and she wrote a book called Strangers Drowning. And what she did is she actually went and spent time with those who were considered do-gooders. And these were people who at extreme levels would go and serve and sacrifice on the behalf of other people. It might be people who are simply giving half of their income so that mosquito nets could be dropped to the African sub-Saharan, so people could actually survive. It might be people whose hearts have broken for adoption and have taken in 20 kids over a 10-year period. It's people who are going to extreme places to actually deliver medical goods and to spend time with people treating them. It's people who over and over again are altruistic and giving themselves away. Now, what's interesting is she was interviewed from some of the work she did and the time that she spent, and someone had asked her, hey, it seems that in religion there's this idea of doing good towards others, but not everyone you worked with is religious. What's some of the things that you learned about this? And she says, first of all, with many religious traditions, there is an acceptance of suffering, not just as part of life, but not necessarily a bad thing at all, because it takes you and makes you become the better person you want, or even pushes you toward salvation. For people of faith, God is in control, and God's love will see the world through. Whereas for secular people, those who may not have a view of God, is all up to us. We're here alone. And that's why for a secular person like myself, there's an additional layer of urgency and despair whenever I face suffering. Now, it's important to note about this, she also comments on this idea that as she saw those who were religious and they had a higher view of God and they had a patience to the suffering, they were also people who recognized the need to act now. That we don't just sit around and wait for everything to be brought to full grace and love and rightness. And as she watched these people, what came up most was that last sentence, the idea that as a secular person, one without a view of God, one that does not believe in God, one that does not see God actually acting in our lives, is that now I have a sense of urgency and desperation, that I have to fix everything, that I have to save everything, that I have to end all of the suffering, that I have to fix all the suffering, that I have to avoid all of the suffering. Because if I'm a secular person, then when my life ends, life ends. And so therefore, I have to get everything right now. How do you do in your current suffering? How do you tend to operate in your current suffering? Do you have a view beyond your current suffering? Do you see ways in which God could actually be doing something through your suffering? I'm going to work through a couple things, but what I want to make clear is that this isn't an everything happens for a reason kind of an idea. It's not the thing that when people are going through suffering, there's words like, oh, don't worry, God must have a big plan for you. I don't know if, like me, you've probably said those things to others before. But the reality is that God also does not like the suffering that you and I experience. God's original creation was not for you and I to experience suffering. God actually, in Jesus, we see, weeps when there is suffering. God is one who is moving towards people in suffering to comfort them. He, in his rightness, is redeeming all things so that one day there will be no more suffering. And at the same time, you and I are invited not only to press into suffering in the ways of owning it and seeing it through, but also stepping into other people's sufferings. And we'll walk through a couple of those. What Larissa points out here I think is important. And if we actually look all the way back to the early church, let's call it 2,000 years ago. I'm not going to give exact dates because I don't have them. But we actually see the ways in which the church was do-gooders. We see these do-gooding actions, but to her point, that was not from a secular view that they had to fix or solve everything. Rodney Stark writes a wonderful book called The Patient Ferment, and he asks the question, why did a small fringe group of people that were against both the government or outside of both the government and the common day religion, why did that actually grow? Why did this thing of Christianity that we still sit here today gathered around from 2,000 years ago, why was it so influential? What was the power that it actually held? Why were people attracted to it? And one of the main things he says is that they had patience. That in their suffering, they could be patient. In their suffering, they could actually wait on God while also acting in the ways that they could. Do you have patience? That's what I was faced with this week. What are the ways in which I'm trying to expedite everything because I don't actually have patience for the things that are happening in and around me? If we go all the way back, this is probably 2nd, 3rd century now, and we experienced this recently through COVID. We could call this a pandemic. Throughout history, there's been plagues often, and the Roman Empire would actually see plagues quite often when you have very low access to medical and people are very closely living to each other. Like, that actually happened a lot more often. And what would happen is that the plagues in that time would happen in the city, and those with means would escape the city, which meant that those without means were stuck in the city. And what would happen is that people would get together and they would try to find ways to solve the suffering that's happening. And they would rely on the government, and they would go to an oracle that would be something outside of themselves and trying to find someone that has the answer to why is this happening? Why does it seem that God is, or our gods are not pleased with us? And people would flee the city. And to all those who couldn't were left behind to suffer. In Carthage in the 250s, 80 years after the Antonine Plague, the Christian community responded to a renewed outbreak of plague very differently from the pagans of Caesarea. Led by Bishop Cyprian, the Christian community responded to the crisis not by cultic acts to appease the gods, but by practical deeds to help suffering people. These deeds not only consciously reaffirmed the Christian's habitus, they applied it in new circumstances and intensified it. The insight to do this did not, as in Asia Minor, come from consulting an external oracle. The insight came from within. It came from within because Cyprian actually reminded them of God's mercy towards them. He looked to the historic creeds of faith throughout Judaism and into Christianity and the words of Jesus, and understanding that mercy has been poured out on us. Therefore, we must be merciful towards others. And they saw no other way but then to stay in the city at the risk of their own life to treat the people who are dying. And they go on to say that it was both for the Christians and it was also for what they would call the pagans. It was for those in the Roman Empire and it was those outside the Romans. It was those who had just shortly before that been persecuting them, and it was those that they were friends with and gathered in worship with. There was no barrier to those that they would show their mercy, to those that they would risk their life. At the same time, they were suffering themselves. This actually came right after, just shortly before that, massive persecution against the Christian church. Massive. The same people they were treating in that time as the plagues were happening were the same people that were just trying to expedite them from the earth. The same people that were just oppressing them are the ones that they're now caring for, because the mercy that's been poured out on them, as Cyprian reminded them. Early in church history, there was also, and still exists, but this idea of infanticide. And the idea is that those who were giving birth, there's a number of ways this could happen, but say a child is born with a defect, say there's some other things in regard to a preferred gender or not. What would happen is that those of the Roman way or the pagan way could set their children outside of the city walls. When I say children, I mean babies. They would set them outside. For all the reasons. And they couldn't set them inside because they couldn't do burials inside the city. So they said, let's set them outside. It was Christians who then walked the walls of the city and collected babies and brought them back in to do the best they could to give life to everybody. Whether defected or not, Christians have been the one forever that have been restoring God's dignity in every single person. They didn't have means. They didn't have power. They didn't have authority. Yet in their own suffering, they went and they pressed into the suffering of others. It's like they went around inviting more suffering into their life. This is where we actually get the ideas of orphanages. The ways in which Christians have treated people medically is why we have hospitals. It is those who are suffering with a view of God who can actually enter into not only their own suffering, but the suffering of others at the same time. And man, it's not like they just disregard their suffering. They are so aware of their own suffering, and they are grieved over their own suffering, and suffering is hard and the worst. At the same time, it seems that suffering can produce something, can invite us towards something. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians, "Praise be to God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our suffering, so also you share in our comfort." This is Paul at a different church writing to a church in Corinth. And he's saying that there's something happening in the ways in which you're experiencing suffering and the ways that we're experiencing suffering and the ways in which we get comforted, the ways that you get comforted. In our suffering, you could be comforted, and in our comforting that you might be going through. And there's something that's all connected to the suffering of Jesus. And he's saying that in the suffering, there can actually be an endurance produced in you and I. That there's something beyond the suffering that you and I are experiencing. This one was kind of hard to write, but coming out of Paul's words and many other places in the scriptures, suffering becomes comforting through shared suffering in Christ's suffering. It's the best I got. But like suffering, like the thing that you're experiencing right now, the thing that you're going through, the thing that those around you are going through, that those in our city are going through, in the Gospels, in the life of Jesus, there's something that becomes comforting. No, that does not mean this happy little life sitting on the couch with a warm blanket and a fire, whatever your ideal of comfort is. We just learned a moment ago that comfort is actually perseverance. It's something to be able to overcome, to have a future hope and a future glory, something to live for beyond the suffering that we're experiencing now. But it happens through sharing it. It happens through actually pressing into the suffering beyond my own and receiving the comfort that other people have in their own suffering, that I could be comforted in the midst of my suffering, so that I can then share my suffering so that others could be comforted. But the only way to do that is to see and know that Christ has suffered, to see somebody, God revealed as a human, hanging on a cross on behalf of all people who deserved it the least out of anybody, because he entered into humanity to suffer. Humanity, being human, is suffering. And yet we have a God who has entered in with us to say, in your suffering, I can produce hope. I can produce glory. I can make all things new. Will you join me in and through your suffering to be a part of my larger story where all things are made right, where all tears are wiped away, where all people are brought together in unity and reconciliation? In and amidst your suffering. Right now, in your own suffering, are you sharing it with anybody? Right now, in your own suffering, are you allowing anyone to share their suffering with you? In your own suffering, have you revisited the suffering of Jesus of Nazareth, who has entered into the depths of what you and I, the most you and I could ever experience? And to hold his hand out, to bring us forward, to have purpose and meaning to live for. See, for the early church, and for so many Christians around the world, and I believe for many of us here in the room, suffering is the way forward, because it's the only way people can look in the midst of our lives, and we yet joyfully can point to a God who has met us in our suffering and our humanity and has given us a future hope and a future glory so that other people could actually see and point to something greater than their own suffering. So first and foremost, this starts with you and I becoming so familiar with the suffering that we're experiencing, not avoiding it. I don't know about you, but man, I have some mechanisms to avoid suffering. I can binge like no one can binge. I will beat you at binging in like my darkest places. Like I have ways to try and push the suffering down. But am I only pushing Christ's suffering further from me to have something produce in me that I can never produce on my own? So here's what I want to invite us to. I want you to come in tune with your suffering, however much you think it is, however little you think it is. And what we're going to do in this practice is actually share our suffering with those here. So someone stand up and just say your suffering out loud. Just kidding. What we want to do is pause. And we're going to do two things on the card that you have in your chair. On one side, you're going to write a suffering. This will be read by someone else, so I would encourage you not to put your name on it unless you would like to. And then you can also go however deep or however shallow you would like. There's no comparison game happening in this. I just want you to pause for a moment. Let the merciful and grace-filled God just meet you. And just invite you on one side of the card to write something in which you're experiencing suffering. Again, this will eventually be shared with a random person who will not know it came from you, if you so choose to participate. And just stay on one side of the card. can finish your final thought, a few more words on the card. And now the fourth suffering that the author earlier points out is suffering that produces transformation. This is actually a way to draw from the three before it and say that there's something that God can actually do in and through the suffering that you and I are experiencing. Oftentimes, I actually don't think we're aware of this until years later, but I think it's worth paying attention to in the moment. And so what I want you to do on the other side of your card is to respond to the suffering that you wrote on the other side, asking what God might be doing in and amidst your current suffering. What are the ways in which you might be being formed? This is also a space that you can write down hopelessness and grief. It's also the space to cry out to God and say, how much longer, Lord? Because ultimately, every moment of suffering is a way to draw closer to Him and to others. And so whatever way in which you might be able to express that, I would invite you to write that on the other side of the card. It might be something that you're past. It might be something you're entering. It might be something that you find yourself here in the moment. But if you were to pause and just invite God into your suffering, what might you write on the other side? About 30 more seconds to finish your thought. And now what we're going to do, we're going to divide the room in two. So anybody in those three chairs are on that side, these three chairs are on that side. Jennifer and John are going to walk down the centers. If this half can pass your cards to this center, if this half can pass your cards to this center, the nice collection person here on the inside. Good. And now I say let's burn them. Let's switch. So you two are going to switch sides. And then everyone's going to receive a card from someone else. You're not going to know who or how unless they wrote their name on it. But you're going to receive a card. And as we start to strum here and move towards singing together, I first want us to enter into someone else's suffering. In and amidst your own, take a few minutes just to take in the suffering that they're experiencing. And in the midst of it, what they might be asking God for, what they might be sensing as transformation. And then the best way you know how, I just ask you just to pray for that person. Not knowing who it is. What's your prayer for them? What are you asking God for on their behalf? And now with their card in your hand, may we imagine this passage a bit more personally now. Praise be to the God and our Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves see from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our suffering, so also you share in our comfort. Why don't we stand together? Here's in maybe an extreme way, inviting us to an imagination of what it looks like to share in our sufferings, and maybe some of the results that can come along the way when we actually press into each other's lives. You don't have to run around telling everyone about your sufferings, but may you more be ready to tell about the joy that you still have within, and the tension it is that it lives with grief and doubt and longing. Drawing again on the early church, speaking about the Roman games where the gladiators conquered. There were times at which the Christians were the one innocently conquered. Someone recording what happened at the end during one of the games. At the very end, after the most of the Christians had been seriously wounded by the animals, the crowd's interest was clearly still lively. For they asked that all the Christians be brought to a central spot where they could see clearly as the gladiators finished them. They saw the executions, but they also saw the Christians mustering the strength of body and will to stand up, gather themselves as a group in the specified spot, and give a final embodied witness. These disparate people, women and men, slave and free, poor and advantaged, kissed each other so that they might bring their martyrdom to completion with the kiss of peace. Exhausted and in pain though they were, in extremis, the prisoners did reflexively, virtually on autopilot, what they had been habituated to do in their services of worship. They exchanged the kiss of peace, embodying a love that transcended social barriers. how did the pagan onlookers respond to the Christians' public witness? Probably most of them viewed the Christians' behavior in the amphitheater as distasteful, indicative of wild-eyed, uncultured enthusiasm. But The Passion, the book written, reports that some members of the crowd found that the Christians had jarred them loose from their former ways of thinking and living. The account tells us of one specific person who became a believer. He was actually the soldier that dealt with all those prisoners in jail. And soon after the Christians were put in jail, he began to treat them well because he observed that they had a great power. Among them, the power of courage, of vision and prayer, of the aura of God. Some weeks later, he became a Christian, and at the very end of the book, in the Christian's last minutes in the amphitheater, before the sword dispatched them, he managed to be with them. And the leader of the Christians admonished him, and he said, "Remember me and remember the faith." He asked him for his ring, dipped it in his own blood, and gave it back to him as a memento, a tangible expression of the faith they had begun to share. The early church believed that the life of Jesus, his ways, his teaching, is all held together by his death and his resurrection, by his suffering that came before glory, and that it's with him, in his suffering, that we get to, and amidst our suffering, stand with each other, to have hope and faith and grace and mercy with one another in our own sufferings as we share our sufferings with each other, and may that produce much comfort in the hope that we have in a God who is all merciful. I pray that you and I today can hold the tension of grief in our suffering with the ultimate hope that God has promised us. May we be reminded that we are to suffer together with and on behalf of, so that more can be comforted by a God who loves it. Let's sing a couple songs. Table of communions are open in the back if you'd like. I'll come up in just a few minutes and close us out.